Thank you, Dr. Faisal. I think he's sounding more like a political activist than a musician now. Somebody asked me this morning because they recognize the presence of Yang Muhammad Zairil from the other side of my other side of the house, and they say, "What about this side of the house?" I say, "Hey, I have not jumped ship." And that side, this side, we are all here, but we are not taking side this morning. I just want to repeat some logistic here. Number one, we are on live streaming at staging.gmomf.org. Number two, there's a live Twitter wall at the back, but in case you can't see it from there, I'm sure you can check on our timeline. It is hashtag capital, it's all capital, hashtag GMMFPS. FPS is for foreign policy stakeholders. Don't worry about the GMM. We simply put GMM just in case FPS means something else to someone else. So we don't want to get into trouble. So GMM, FPS means today and beyond. And our website is www.gmomf.org. Thank you again, Dr. Faisal. Can we now move to our third speaker, Dr. Nicholas Jeffrey, please?
Okay, I think I'm in business here. Thank you for the invitation to participate. When I first learned about this movement for moderation, I felt this was perhaps one of the most important things happening in the world today, the inception of this movement. Moderation I think is probably a goal and a desire for most people, but we put them in a classification we call the silent majority. And the silent majority is often not heard from. What this movement provides is a voice for the silent majority. The challenge for the movement is to how to make it an effective voice. This is not an easy answer to this, how to make it effective, how to reach out, and how to make this a meaningful movement. We live in difficult times. I don't know if it's the most difficult, you could argue this is the best of times or the worst of times. You can take both perspectives. I grew up in the Cold War period, when in primary school we had drills every other day anticipating an atomic bomb being dropped. And we had to dive for cover under our desks and avoid looking out the window because we would be blinded by the atomic flash. This is what I grew up with in primary school, anticipating an atomic bomb blast during the Cold War. We've evolved from that. In fact, I have mentioned in other audiences, I'm a product of illegal Greek immigrants in America. My parents were illegal immigrants. Suffice to say, I made out okay. And my goal in primary school, believe it or not, was to become president of the United States. That was my goal. Okay? And in fact, early on in life, I got involved politically and achieved some elected positions. Didn't pursue it any further because my wife didn't like going door to door asking for votes, okay? So I changed from a political career to a business career. Now, coming to this subject of moderation, it's not a completely new subject. Now, I've done some reading, and Civil society is basically what we're talking about. And it's about bringing diverse groups together to know one another, conflict resolution, coalition building, and collaborative problem solving. A great civilization is a drama lived in the minds of people. And this is from a book on civil society. And what is in the minds of people? Now, you mentioned the young people involved in the UN program. Open Doors, was it? Whatever it's called. Model United Nations. What do young people want? And there's a gentleman called Maslow that developed a hierarchy of needs for people in general. And at the base, you have to have food, clothing, and shelter, safety and security. For a large proportion of the population, that's not available. The very basic needs. When we worked on the new economic model for Malaysia, we found that 40% of the population of Malaysia is living on less than 1,500 ringgit a month. Food, clothing, and shelter is what that bottom 40% is concerned about. Once you move up the Maslow hierarchy, you have higher aspirations, the highest of which is self-fulfillment. We all want the ability of self-fulfillment and achieving self-esteem. And what does it take? What kind of an environment do you need to have to make that happen? You have to have a strong economy, you have to have jobs, you have to have education, you have to have stability, you have to have good parenting. There are a number of things that are required to achieve self-fulfillment, but ultimately it comes down to the individual. Regardless of your circumstances, you need to be able to rise above your circumstances, and society needs to enable that, rising above. Now, I have been in Malaysia for 20 years. I have seen much in my 20 years here. I think the changes that I have seen are changes also that are occurring in other parts of the world. The one thing that is a constant is change. And somebody talked about evolution. We are constantly changing and needing to adapt. Even the laws and justice is, one Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court says, justice is like a suit of clothes. It needs to change with the times. And the times are changing very rapidly, and this is another major challenge, not only for youth, but also for the moderation movement. So how do you address moderation? One thing that I've learned in my 20 years here in Malaysia, that it has achieved two outstanding documents, the most outstanding of which is Vision 2020. This is an extraordinary document. Vision 2020 was drafted by a gentleman called Norton Soapy, whom I knew very well, and visited with him in his last days of his illness, and promulgated by then Prime Minister Tun Dr. Mahathir. If I can read this, there's not much light here, but it says, Vision 2020 is to become a united Malaysia nation with a sense of common and shared destiny. There must be a nation at peace with itself, and Why don't you read it? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. This is Nicholas talking, not me. Okay? Vision 2020 is to become a united Malaysian nation with a sense of common and shared destiny. This must be a nation at peace with itself, territorially and ethnically integrated, living in harmony and full and fair partnership, made up of one Bangsa Malaysia with potential loyalty and dedication to the nation.
Those are powerful words. Very powerful words. Now, where is Malaysia today in terms of achieving that? It still has a ways to go, okay? It's evolving. Now, I'm supposed to speak principally about the role of business. And lo and behold, I read in 1991 Tun Dr. Mahathir on the role of business. This nation cannot rely on the private sector as the primary engine of growth if our private sector is inefficient and lethargic. You must be strong and dynamic, robust and self-reliant, competent and honest. That was the challenge that he threw out to the private sector. Now he goes on about the role of the private sector in achieving Vision 2020. A big part of it is human capital development, social responsibility, and what business looks for is predictability. Basically, they're making long-term investments and want to have a predictable environment for realizing return on their investments, but they also have a responsibility to the community that they serve, to the people that work for them, human resource development, making people feel they're part of a team. Now that's what society is all about as well, inclusiveness, people feeling they're a part of a team, and moderation is in effect that aspiration. People having common and shared destiny, values, and goals. And I would argue that one of the things that the moderation movement could do is make the world aware of Vision 2020. Because there are powerful words there that set the values and the ideals that every nation should aspire towards. Malaysians don't realize what a powerful document this is. But businesses need a vision to succeed. The movement for moderation needs a vision to succeed. Individuals need a vision to succeed. And societies need a vision to succeed. So, in conclusion, I would say that how does moderation movement move forward? I say have a good vision, establish the values that are important, and maybe even use the Malaysian model as a template for the rest of the world. I think it's a powerful document. And the new economic model is another powerful document, and I don't have time to go into that, but it aspires for high income, inclusiveness, and sustainability. Three key goals to have moderation. So that concludes my remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Zefri, and especially in your last few words, you remind us of the existence of the new economic model, which many of us believe needs to be relaunched in some way or the other, at least perhaps as part of the national reconciliation process vis-a-vis GE 13 or whatever, depending on how you look at it. Ladies and gentlemen, may I now invite Tan Sri Yasmi Agam.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saladin, Chairman, Tan Sri Rizali, Chairman of GMM, DGP panelists, ladies and gentlemen. I must express my appreciation for being invited. I didn't even know that I'm going to be punished today. So I just need to listen more to learn from you all. But you have to listen to the various speakers, and I think that Lucy has asked me to comment more on the UPR process and human rights. But before I go to that, let me say something about my own notion of moderation, and perhaps to give some views of how we should approach. I think I must commend first the initiative by the Prime Minister and his statement recently to the General Assembly, which I consider as bold and courageous. It's not easy to make that kind of statement in a world which is beset by violence and upheavals in other parts of the world. And here you have the Prime Minister of Malaysia making that statement. As a foreign policy platform, I think it captures the center. Most human beings are moderate. There are very few extremists. But unfortunately, the moderates are the silent majority, as put by one of the panelists. So this is, I think, you have, as you begin the initiative, the sense of satisfaction that the majority of the population of the world are with you. The problem is how to capture that center and sustain it. And I think like charity, moderation must begin at home. I've said it before in some other audiences, and I think I'd like to repeat it here. Because our credibility as a proponent of this idea will be at stake if we, Malaysia, do not put our house in order. We have touted to the world that we are a moderate, harmonious nation, in spite of our differences in cultures, religions, background, and so on. But for a country like Malaysia, I think this is largely because of a tolerance, and a tolerance of each other's differences. But for multiracial, multi-religious country like Malaysia, tolerance alone is not enough. Tolerance would essentially mean that you just stomach it, the difference you might not like from a different community, and so on and so forth. When you hear, for instance, the azan in the morning, Muslims are used to it, but for non-Muslim maybe it's a kind of distraction. To tolerate it just, I think in that kind of context it's not good enough. You have to begin to understand why Muslims, say out the azan. And for Muslims themselves also, to ask ourselves, this is a very sensitive area, especially for me as a Muslim, whether in the context of the modern world we are in today, we should continue to use the Azan Acts which was used 1,000 years ago, centuries ago. When we know when the prayers are in, we can Google, we can look at newspapers, and so on and so forth. So Muslims themselves must ask ourselves whether we should continue with this practice. Maybe if it is intended to tell the immediate neighborhood to say so, then maybe one way would be to tone it down to the area, the neighborhood that would want to be notified of the azan. So I think it's a quid pro quo, give and take. And I think over time, non-Muslims will understand what the usefulness of azan will understand. I've met a diplomat, a Western diplomat who went to Cairo, was posted to Cairo. He was bothered at first by the azan. In Cairo there are many mosques. But by the time he left, after 3-4 years, somewhere else, he missed the azan. For a non-Muslim, he did not convert to Islam, but he missed the azan. So there's something like just from my own sense, that I think there should be understanding, give and take, and appreciation of each other's different cultures, different backgrounds. By all of us, Muslims, non-Muslims, and people with different cultures and religions. And I think we begin to think and to have greater dialogue. And one of those who support and encourage the former Prime Minister, Tun Abdullah, to push for the idea of interfaith dialogue. By having interfaith dialogue, it doesn't bring down Islam, which is the official state religion of the country, to a low level. interact, to try to understand each other's differences. I think this is something, I think this is center of moderation. So my advice to the GMMF FP is to, in trying to capture the center, you must begin at home. Because sometimes people ask you, as a former diplomat, because at that time the moderation was not there yet. But I assume now, if I was still a diplomat, people would say, well, have you put your house in order? So I think for young diplomats who are here, serving the country abroad, I think this would be the main, what I call, criticism, if you will, from others. So, so it must begin here. So I appreciate and commend the initiative taken to have this dialogue among us, and that there should be more of it. So that as we promote the idea internationally, we can show Malaysia as an example, as a shining example of moderation. We have in this country now increased level of intolerance, pushing ideas which are exclusive. As one panel said, doctor said that in sometimes in certain areas, exclusivity cannot be avoided. But there are limitations to it. In the context of universal, what I call human rights, values, it is zero tolerance for exclusivity, actually. That's why when we accede to or ratify to international conventions, generally people do not want us to have reservations on resolutions or conventions. Because when you have reservations, then it raises questions about whether we accept those norms. But I think for a country like Malaysia, in which Islam is official religion, sometimes it's important to maintain that small area of reservation in order to proceed forward. Now, the chair has mentioned that I should maybe speak more about the UPR process in Geneva. It was a good process as far as the country is concerned. If I were a former diplomat listening to, I was there as an observer, it was music to the ears of the government. It was a peer process. Countries are evaluated after, every 4 years or so of its human rights standards in the country. Now, 104 countries spoke during the Malaysian session, and as a majority are developing countries, were members of the non-aligned countries, friendly to Malaysia. Most of they had 1 minute 4 seconds, unfortunately, to make their intervention because so many countries spoke and there was a limitation of time. And I was watching at the clock. I think it's about 60 seconds or 50 seconds, almost a minute. People were commending Malaysia. This is the diplomatic way of, opening statements. And they had very few seconds left to make recommendations. There was 1 or 2 countries, I won't mention which, mostly I think Western countries, who because the time constraint went straight to make the recommendations to Malaysia. But as a former diplomat, I found it as rather rude, very abrupt. So that's why countries, when they spoke and used their 1 minute, 4 seconds, they used a lot of time praising Malaysia. Which is good. Malaysia has done quite a lot of things in terms of human rights promotion in social and economic areas, for instance. In certain areas of women empowerment, not completely full. Children, protection of children, so on and so forth. But there are areas that the delegates on the table did not touch on, except for a few. And these are the things that I think, as Malaysia basks in the commendation by various countries around the table at the Geneva conference, we should also pause and look at our own record. We have done well as a country, as a former, I'm very proud to have defended the country abroad. But on human rights, of the core 9 conventional rights, instruments of human rights, we have only done 3. on women, children, and recently, about 2 years ago, on disability. There are 6 more unopened. And in some of these conventions are about 50, 60 years old. And the position by the government has been for a long time, as I was told, and is still maintained, being maintained by the government. That is that before we accede to the conventions, to the remaining 6, we have to put our house in order. We have to change the rules, amend maybe certain legislation and so on and so forth. This kind of rationale was accepted and credible many years ago when we were young in promoting the idea of explaining to the world why we are slow. But after so many years, it loses credibility. And I think for young diplomats now in defending the country abroad as to why Malaysia is not acceded to the instruments, it is a very tough task. So we have to begin the process. This study, this attempt to put the house in order before we accede to the conventions must be accelerated. Malaysia is only 6, 7 years before we reach the developed country status that we wish to attain. By which time, Malaysia would be judged by higher standards, the standards of a developed country. How would our diplomats, leaders, including the Prime Minister himself, whoever is the Prime Minister, maybe a woman at the time, to be able to put his or her head high and defend the country in terms of human rights promotion, practice, and so on, when maybe there are still 6 of these conventions that have not been ratified or acceded, or maybe a few more. So I've been hoping, asking the government to push the process forward so that maybe 1 convention a year to be acceded to, the easier ones first, to plug the low-hanging fruits first. But the question is, which is the easier one? To my perspective, maybe the Convention Against Torture. The fact that we have not done it gives the impression that we somehow condone torture, which is not the case when we talk to the police and so on and so forth. But it is a very complex area because it also takes into account, beyond torture, inhumane and cruel treatment, like caning. And caning is prescribed, is allowed in our society. So we have to bring in not only the police, but also religious leaders, teachers, and so on and so forth. So it's a very complex issue, but it has been pushed forward. And then there are political and civil rights convention. There is economic and social and cultural rights convention, which has not been done. There are a few more which have not been done. So many of these are, as I said, 50 years old. So the time, I think, is running very fast. We have only about 7 years or less to be a developed country if you want to attain that status. And I think this is one, I think GMM should also try to push. Because unless we are there with the other developed countries, it's very difficult to preach about moderation. I think this is a challenge for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ashley, on your points deliberated. May I do something very personal, if you can bear with me? One of my teachers, and he's my greatest teacher, is in this hall. I cannot but acknowledge his presence, and please join me in welcoming my teacher, Professor Emeritus Tan Sri Dr. Khoo Keng Kim. Thank you, sir. He's a former commissioner with Suhakam and now a member of ProHam. And yeah, we all know. I love you, sir. Okay, brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, that was the end of the 4 speakers sharing with us. I think everyone spoke very eloquently on the topics of their choice or theme of their choice. I just want to, not to summarize, but to recommend another book which somehow I think may represent, if not all, but part of what they were trying to say, that foreign policy begins at home. It's actually a newly published book, maybe not so new, but still new, by Richard Haas. I think many of us know Richard Haas. The title of the book is Foreign Policy Begins at Home. And what a coincidence. And among others, he mentioned, well, though this is about the US, but I think it has some bearing and relevant to many of us. He mentioned something about, you know, you can't have a situation where you are overreaching abroad, but underperforming at home. I don't know if that perhaps echo what Tan Sri Asmi was trying to allude to. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to open about 5 minutes for Q&A first. Should any one of us have some pressing questions to members of the panel? Yes, I recognize YB Zario.
Thank you.
You are today representing Penang Institute or your party, sir?
Representing myself. Thank
Okay,
you.
sir.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning. First of all, I'd like to say thank you very much for inviting me to this conference. How could I refuse? You know, Datuk Saifuddin is a friend, and Tan Sri Rizali is my uncle. Well, firstly, I'd like to say actually this global movement of moderates is a very clever way of reasserting ourselves, our presence internationally. I think we can all agree that Malaysian diplomacy has been on an extended lull ever since the more exciting days of the Mahathir era, something that I'm sure Tan Sri Rizali would readily attest to. But all in all, I think it's a good effort. Datuk Saifuddin is probably the right man to lead this. He is a great moderate, although slightly underappreciated by his less than moderate party. But coming back to what Dr. Faisal said, when he talked about the behavior of CSOs and NGOs, having an effect on the country's image. But surely the government's stance has a greater impact. And on this, I'd like to bring up the issue of Kalimah Allah. And my question is this moderate? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I recognize Christopher Leong, President of the Bar. He is here. Thank you, brother, for coming. He has to leave urgently after this, so please bear with me if I were to invite Chris to take the floor.
Thank you very much, Datuk Saifuddin, as well as thank you for extending the invitation for me to be here this morning. I must say that this is the first time I'm attending a GMM event, so I came more to listen than to say anything, to see what the issues are going to be about and so forth. Obviously, I was very much attracted by the very concept that there is a movement for moderation. I just wanted to say a few things. One is that in Malaysia, I think one of the things that we should think about when we are looking for moderation, and Dr. Saifuddin is very correct, foreign policy begins at home. So when we talk about global movement for moderation, I think we should be able to say on the international stage or reflect on the international stage values that we have domestically first. And so one of the things I think we should think about would be how do we deal with people that have extremist views, the antithesis of moderation. Very, very often we look at the way people do or say things and then we make a judgment as to whether they are moderate or not. I would like to say that it is not the way they do things, but rather the values and principles that they hold. You can advocate very strongly, with very strong words, a very moderate view. We have to recognize and distinguish between the two, and then we've got to stop pandering. We have to stop pandering to people with extremist views, right-wing views. Why? Because then we appear to legitimize their positions. Unfortunately, I think that of late in Malaysia, we are seeing that we are seen to be pandering to right-wing extremist views. And I think that that's something that we very much need to address. I would like to actually ask Tan Sri Hasmi Agam, because I'm very interested in this UPR session recently in October. Perhaps Tan Sri could tell us, I know there were 100 over countries in the Malaysian session, but maybe Tan Sri could just tell us, the one or two major concerns that countries that were present at the Malaysia session, what their major concerns were in terms of Malaysia, not in terms of our policy approach. I know you've spoken about Malaysia still not having acceded to 7 of the international conventions. Six conventions. But whether they did bring up any issues that are current and which were of grave concern to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Yes, this is probably the last question for this round. We will have more after this. Yeah, Dr. Alantas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was very interested by what Tan Sri Hasmi Agam was saying about the need for Malaysia to put our house in order. Many years ago, in the 80s to be more specific, whenever one Malaysian traveled abroad in the Muslim world, we would hear very positive comments. In countries like Iran and Turkey, for example, people would be saying that, look at Malaysia, it's a Muslim country holding on to its tradition, but at the same time modernizing, and it's a model. Now if you travel in much of the Muslim world today, people are saying, look at Malaysia, don't be like Malaysia. There is a general feeling that Malaysia is heading in a bad way in certain areas of life. Certainly we have made many advances, but where extremism is concerned, religious extremism, there is a very worrying trend. So for me, my concern is, I hope there will be chance, Mr. Chairman, later on for us to discuss more specific issues. But for me, the concern is what civil society organizations and an organization like GMFF can do in terms of putting pressure on the government to bring about the kinds of reforms that we need in order to make Malaysia a truly moderate country. The role of the media also is very important, because I think we have seen the role that the media has played in terms of fomenting more extremist ideas. If I just were to cite one example, the Johor Surau incident involving a Buddhist group from Singapore. The media failed to report the violent manner in which the Buddhists were treated by a group of Malays. Their artifacts were, handled in a very violent manner. There was even an attempt to beat up the Buddhist monk, but fortunately, the people involved were restrained. There was nothing about that in the media. And what is interesting also, as far as I know, the Malays involved were never reprimanded by the authorities. So we had a completely, skewed picture of what happened. This is just one example, and I think we can give many other examples. So the role of the media and the role of civil society organizations to me, this is the real problem in this country, getting the government to embark on reforms changing laws where laws need to be changed, and putting some constraints on religious leaders and authorities who are going in a bad way. Thank you.
Thank you. I would invite the speakers, should you want to comment, but I will keep the last one to Tan Sri because there were specific questions to Tan Sri Hasmi. Dato' Jeffrey, do you want to say anything? And then I just pass it to Dato' Faisal, and then Dato' Ridwan, and last but not least, Tan Sri.
A lot of the comments were Malaysia specific. Having been in Malaysia 20 years, as I mentioned earlier, I've seen a lot of change, but I think this is one of Malaysia's most critical periods. There's some difficult decisions that need to be made. And as I was saying during the break to one of the panelists here, you cannot make decisions based on looking 1 year ahead, which tend to be the political outlook. You have to look at where Malaysia wants to be in Vision 2020 many years out. What kind of a world are your children going to be in and your grandchildren? Because the decisions being made today are going to affect them. Making the wrong decisions today means 20 years from now, Malaysia is going to be in the wrong place. It's that important. And there's some, the challenges become even more difficult as time progresses, because as people realize through the media where they stand today compared to others, they demand more. People are becoming more demanding. And that imperative needs to be translated into action. And sometimes the political will is absent because of wanting to satisfy all the voices. Now, that's not just Malaysia, that's a problem around the world. But it takes courage. And I think what's needed is courage, but also supplementing that courage by having the movement of moderation show that silent majority supports those difficult decisions. There's an obligation on all of us, the silent majority, if you will, to make known that we're behind the right decisions. Just make them.
Thank you.
Just two comments from me. One is on YB Zairel's general question, that is, not the specific one, general question on whether the government stance is even more important than that of how CSOs behave. I would agree, yes, it is. There have been many occasions when Mercy Malaysia has had to conduct what we term as humanitarian diplomacy abroad with governments in other countries which may not have the same kind of opinion or a favorable view towards some positions which the Malaysian government is taking, not to contradict, but sometimes to explain and even to elaborate. So yes, I would agree that a government stance, generally speaking, is as important, if not more important, of course, than that of civil society as a whole. But I guess the point I was making was that, as you rightly caught on, which is, yes, our behavior, our collective behavior is also just as important. That's number one. On that related specific issue which you brought up, and on this I'm not speaking on behalf of Mercy Malaysia, just my own personal opinion on it, is that I think most of us here would have welcomed more intellectual discourse, more open discourse about the issue of Kalimat Allah, and more transparent discussions, and honest ones as well. I guess that's the elephant in the room, and this is where our learned colleague has mentioned about how things are moving perhaps in the wrong direction, and as Chris said, that the government sometimes, and even some of us sometimes, pander to views which are antithetical to moderation because it is politically the thing to do, unfortunately. So that's the problem, that's the elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room, ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, cannot be addressed in one dimension only. And I think Nicholas was trying to get at that. Being a Malaysianized, naturalized Malaysia, I guess he has that view and he has that position which allows him to see us for the last 20 years or so with a bigger vision. And I guess that's what's needed. And we cannot pretend that those other issues don't matter, because they do. They do. Until we resolve some of those issues, we are going to get very slow progress in the issues which concern us most in this room at the moment. And partly because the powers that be, or those aspiring to be powers that be, will be constrained in their decision making, regardless of the fact that what you said is very true, that we are fully supportive and fully behind good and right decisions. But those right decisions sometimes don't come because they have to think about where their votes are going to come from. Yeah? That's unfortunately where the reality is. Last point is, with regards to convention, I'd just like to add, from the humanitarian perspective, although it's not in the UPR agenda, there are 2 conventions which Malaysia have not signed, although Yang Abang Perdana Menteri actually said that we would sign soon after he took office, which was the 1951 and 1961, respectively, conventions on refugees and statelessness. This is, again, something which affects our image internationally, number one. It also constrains a bit our advocacy, if you like, in foreign policy. If you talk about the Rohingyas, for example, they are stateless people, and yet we ourselves do not sign on to the Statelessness Convention. Of course, there are political as well as economic motives behind why it is not so. But remember, the Prime Minister actually said yes. This was 3 years ago. Then, of course, I presume some quieter discussions took place at the Prime Minister's department, and it never came forth. Yeah. And this is an example of where civil society can do more in advocating. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Rizal.
Thank you. Well, I was involved in the initial discussions and brainstorming sessions we had before GMM took off. And my concern then, and still is now, very much now, more so now, since we have been quite successful in the international stage, is the internal contradiction, precisely the internal contradiction. And I'm so glad that Dr. Saifuddin and our chairman, Dr. Rizal Ismail, have decided to have this dialogue session. I'm hoping that this is just beginning, more to come. Because we need the help of the CSOs. We cannot allow the extremist fringes of our society to determine our national agenda. We cannot afford to do that. And in multiracial, multi-religious society like us, and in the context of the new elements of new society that Dr. Saifuddin mentioned just now, with the social networking, the internet, and the role of the non-state stakeholders. We really need the help of CSOs to be more vocal, to be more active on the ground. As I said, that we have to, moderation is a way of life. We have to start it at home, not just at home in Malaysia, but in our very homes, and in the villages, in the mosques, in the churches, in the temples and whatnot, where we have to propagate, believe, and practice moderation. And we really hope that the CSOs will help us address and help us to resolve some of these very serious internal contradictions that we have today in Malaysia. Thank you.
Thank you. There's one specific question by Mr. Falion, addressed to me for the APR process, also mentioned for the others as well. As I said, the time cost was there, and it was a peer kind of rating evaluation. So people generally wanted to be polite. There's a problem, and I raised it with the head of the UPR division in Geneva and the Human Rights Council as to how to improve future methods of review assessment. They say it's difficult because at the end of the day, it is up to the government to accept what modality. So there is a constraint, but the challenge is to national institutions like SWACAM and civil society to push, to nudge their respective governments forward. We are not the only ones being evaluated, there are many others as well. Some have even world records in Malaysia. But in terms of accession to conventions, many are much better. Malaysia, unfortunately, for all its progress, development, so on and so forth, highly regarded in the world, is among, I would say, the last 10 countries that have acceded to or ratified only 3 or less. In ASEAN, here, Malaysia, Singapore, Brunei, Myanmar, with just 3. And I think with what is happening in Myanmar now, in fact, when I was in Myanmar twice recently, I challenged them to a race as to who would exit faster. And I think I can place my bet on Myanmar. I might do much better. Now the problem is, as far as we are concerned, the attitude of the authorities in Malaysia, including Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and is that we do not want to emulate others to just, sign up and do nothing about it. Many countries actually sign up and they are very slow in implementing. But nevertheless, on paper they're very good. The point is, should we, at this stage, when some of the conventions are about 50 years old or more, take a purist approach, continue to take a purist approach, when we are not doing very much in terms of promoting it. So that to the extent that it loses credibility, people are asking it's just an excuse. There is no political will. This is a challenge. Now, to your question, Chris, about the issues that we raised, this was one of the issues. The lack of accession to international instruments. Some countries mentioned specifically the 3, ICCR, ICCPR, and CAT. But others mentioned the whole 6, the remaining 6 you have not done. Practically almost every country mentioned it, even in passing. For instance, in terms of the concerns, the main concern is lack of freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, religion, and on the issue of women and children, particularly with regard to the indigenous people, women and children, in terms of their education and so on and so forth, they've been sidelined, peripheralized. This was also highlighted in our SWACAM's own national inquiry on land rights of indigenous people. So this was picked up by our peers, the other countries in Geneva. Immigrant workers, refugees. There's a reason why the Refugee Convention has not been acceded to, because as far as the government is concerned, if we accede to the Refugee Convention, it is like what they call putting a green flag, a green traffic light to allow people, to encourage people to come to Malaysia. Even with the tough things they have to go through, refugees flood to Malaysia. So the feeling is that if you accede to the convention, this is actually raising, giving green light. But what I think the government has done is working closely with UN Commission for Refugees on the quiet. So our point in SWACAM is that since you're working closely with UNHCR, why don't we accede it? And as the Prime Minister has already stated in public, But I'm not too sure whether we'll be rushing into that because there are 6 core conventions which have not done. The Refugee Convention is not considered as a core convention, but the 6 that I mentioned have not been done for the last 20 years. But if we can accede to the Refugee Convention, so much better, because these issues are interrelated. The other issues, Chris, is the death penalty, human trafficking and death penalty. So these are the issues, 5, 6, 7 issues, which were brought up by almost everybody, including our friendly country members of the non-aligned movement, politely, but stated so. So this is the challenge for the government. In 1.5 years' time, in 2018, on the threshold of our becoming a developed country in 2020, we will be reviewed. And I hope that by that time, we would have acceded to all, if not all, at least most of the conventions, including the refugee one. So these are the main challenges, because otherwise the governments will continue to say we are taking steps, there's no timeline. So one of the things that I think the peers through the Troika, which is looking at, might give some timeline rather, if it can be done. But I think Malaysia, the government, and any government also being reviewed, will not agree to a timeline put. This is a problem. If you put a timeline, the government will reject the recommendation. But if it's general, I think they will be accepted. The problem is when it is in general term, it is work in progress kind of report at the next review. So I would rather that maybe through your foundation, since you're promoting this as a foreign policy platform which begins at home, we should nudge the government to accede to all the remaining conventions. There is no reason why we should not. If this might take, personal take, not a sort of position set, if there are difficulties in acceding to the convention because of fundamental religious values, I think we should exercise the right of reserving. I think reservation, small reservation, temporary, maybe time-bound reservation, if possible, but on areas that we cannot cross the threshold because of religious differences, on issues that, in the Quran, for instance, which Muslims take seriously, then I suppose we have to maintain the reservation forever. I think this is one weakness of the UDHR. When they negotiated the principles of the UDHR, the 30 principles, the Muslim countries were there, Malaysia was not there in 1948, did not create a formulation to allow for some countries to have this kind of reservation, or to delete, any reference to it, that is not universal. We made a study of the UDHR, in comparison with the Cairo human rights principle. By and large, they are the same. The Cairo principle, what I call, make on human rights, make references to divinity, to God, because it is the Islamic countries kind of convention. But the UDHR is a secular document. There's no reference to the creator. But the principles are largely the same. And when we analyze with IIS, the think tank, we found that maybe about 2% of UDHR may create problems with Muslims in Muslim countries on issues of LGBT, for instance, and issues of women to a certain extent, not very, very large. So these are things that I think there should be discussion, as the doctor said, on issues of Allah, for instance. It's a sensitive issue in Malaysia, but I think there should be consultation, discussion among all parties, interfaith or even by the lay public, to try to understand why the Malays in Malaysia take this very strong exception to the use of the word Allah, when semantically it is a translation of the word God in Arabic. But for Malay Muslims, it is used as a proper name of the God that Muslims worship. The God that begets, not no begotten. This is a problem. I think if a non-Muslim understand this, they perhaps would not push it to the Malays. On the other hand, the Malays, if they engage in discussion with non-Muslims and also Muslims in the Middle East, there might be greater understanding as to, and there may be some change of position might take place. So, but I think we should push it. This is the problem. When we tend to push it, you create this problem. And I think the government of the day wants to ensure that there's no violence in the street. So he goes to court, and the ruling has been made. But I think this is something that Malaysians, as we wish to promote ourselves as a champion of moderation, should do domestically. Have a discussion. All points of views can be discussed, and I think at the end of it, there will be greater understanding and appreciation of the differences in ours. After all, human rights begin to respect for differences of positions, of views, your attire, and so on. And then, from respect, it leads to understanding. And perhaps love. Maybe it's difficult to have love, even within the family. But it may be possible as an ultimate goal to create this trend towards love among ourselves, which is the ideal for mankind anyway. But tolerance is not enough, as I said. Beyond tolerance, there should be greater understanding. So I would support very strongly the idea of discussion, more in-depth dialogue with ourselves.
Thank you, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, could you please join me in giving a big round of applause to all the four. Just before we go for our 5 minutes break, I must underline 5 minutes break. Malaysian style, they add times to 5 minutes. Yeah. When we come back, it's going to be an open discussion. We do not actually prepare a specific team. This is the first time we are doing the stakeholders meeting. Please just speak up, be as precise as possible. I know there are issues on minorities, on women, on youth, on ethics, on the arts, and so on and so forth that people want to bring to the table. By all means, please do so. And what we plan to do is, after this, actually starting tomorrow, the foreign policy stakeholders will go online. We will do a Google Plus community invite to you guys, and then we can continue online. But we will also have smaller group meetings, focus group, if you like. For instance, I think on the 9th of November, we will host with Proham a discussion on the Cairo Declaration on human rights. And people are free to suggest, and we would love to be a part of any dialogues or any discussion on certain issues that can enhance people-to-people diplomacy, that can enhance the principles of moderation. That's a key factor in foreign policy coming from the people. So, ladies and gentlemen, please, tea is served outside. Feel free. And please, please, please come back after about 5 minutes. Thank you.